Welcome to Talking Kootenay Books. My name is Keith Powell. I'm your host, and today I'm with Elinor Florence. Elinor's from Invermere. Great to have you on the show again. This is your third appearance, so means you're a busy writer. I just wanted to talk a little bit about your latest book. It's called Wildwood, as I mentioned, and just tell me what the premise is.
Well, this is a little bit different than my previous two books, which have both had a wartime theme. This is a contemporary novel, and it's about a young single mother from Phoenix, Arizona. I wanted her to come from a very hot place, and one day she gets a call from a lawyer telling her that she has inherited an old abandoned farm way up in northern Alberta in the Peace River district, on condition that she and her little girl live there for 1 year off the grid. I wanted to explore the idea of whether a young modern woman from the city could live the life of our pioneer ancestors now that we're hearing so much about off-the-grid living.
Okay, interesting premise. So what inspired you to come up with this idea?
Well, a couple of things really. It has always been my dream to buy and renovate an old house. Unfortunately, my husband will have nothing to do with this idea. So I thought the only way I'm going to fulfill my fantasy of living in an old house is to write about one. So the house itself is almost like a character in the book, and the house is still fully furnished even though it's been unoccupied for many years. And so I had a great time describing all the wonderful details and furnishings and things that she finds in the old house.
Right. So obviously you're writing about something that you're very interested in.
Yes.
And that comes through in your writing as well. Let's just compare that with the other books that you've put out. I know you have two others out as well.
Well, my first novel was a wartime novel about a farm girl from Saskatchewan who joins the Air Force and goes overseas in World War II and becomes an interpreter of aerial photographs. My second book was actually a nonfiction collection of interviews that I did with World War II veterans. I'm very interested in research, historical research, and so even though my novel Wildwood is contemporary, I managed to work in a lot of local history because in the old house, my heroine Molly discovers the diary that belonged to the original inhabitant of the house, who was the first pioneer in that area. And I've tried to be as authentic as possible. I read 35 pioneer memoirs about the Peace River area before I constructed the Great Aunt's diary. So there is a lot of authentic history in the book as well.
So I noticed at the end of each chapter was sort of a countdown or a sort of a timeline there as to how long your character was living in this sort of abandoned farm. What was that all about? Like, just to explain that sort of literary device.
Well, in order for her to collect her inheritance and inherit the farm, she had to survive there for 365 days. Many of those days were difficult ones, so she is keeping track on her calendar and crossing off the days. So I had a countdown in process so that the readers could know how much longer she had to survive.
I see. So you worked with the same publisher, is that right?
Yes, Dundurn Publishing in Toronto.
Okay, and how was that experience?
Well, it's been a wonderful experience. They're the largest Canadian-owned publisher now in the country, and they have always had a very strong interest in Canadian history. They published the Canadian Encyclopedia, for example, and many other nonfiction books. So it's kind of in their wheelhouse to publish Canadian historical fiction as well.
Right. So the book's been out almost a year, and I know I wanted to try and get you on the show earlier, but you were out promoting the book, and that's one thing I admire about you is when you have a book out in the marketplace, you really get out there and promote it. How was that experience this time around?
I enjoyed it. I always enjoy meeting people. Your book is like your child, so if you aren't championing your book, then it tends to get lost because, as you know, there are hundreds of thousands, millions of books that are in print. And so you really have to go out there and tell people about your book and what it's about. And so I did a driving tour all the way up through northern Alberta and Saskatchewan to libraries and bookstores and other venues. And everywhere I go, I meet people that I love meeting, and many of them have very interesting stories of their own.
So tell me about that experience. So you walk into a room that maybe you know, obviously you haven't met many of those people, or if any of them. How is it that you go about presenting your book?
Well, I actually put together a slideshow because particularly with the wartime novel, I was trying to explain what an aerial photograph looked like. And I realized it would be so much easier just to show people. So I have a PowerPoint presentation about my heroine's experiences during World War II. And so then I went ahead and did the same thing for Wildwood. And so I tell people about farming in the Peace River area and about pioneer life. And of course, there's no shortage of historical photographs available. And I think that people really appreciate the visual more than just watching me talk.
Right. Well, I know as a writer and an author myself, sometimes you can go and these events have one person and the next time the room is full. So how do you sort of anticipate or prepare for your audience?
That's a tricky one because you really never know how many people are going to come. Occasionally, a group will sponsor me and sell tickets, and then I know that there are going to be 80 or 100 people there, and so that's a little bit easier. If there are only 4 or 5 people, well, they get exactly the same treatment as the 100 people,
Right.
and you know, in a way, it's almost more intimate that way because I have more chance to talk to them afterwards.
Sure. What's been the reaction to the book Wildwood?
Well, I'll tell you, I was a little bit nervous because I did what you're not supposed to do. Once you have a genre established, you're supposed to stick with that genre. But I have felt that I had really exhausted all the possibilities with the Second World War, and I wanted to write about a different aspect of Canadian history. But I think that my audience is still pretty much the same. It's people who like Canadian history, like Western Canada. You know, many of their ancestors were pioneers as well as veterans. So I've been pleasantly surprised by the reception.
Good. I know you do a number of blogs or columns on your own as well, so you're always writing. But I understand that's changed directions a little bit as well. Can you just talk
Yes.
about that a bit?
For 5 years, I published a World War II story on my website. And in December 2018, I wrote my final wartime story, and I decided to shift gears a little bit and start talking more about myself. So I'm putting myself out there a little more. My new blog is called Letters from Windermere, and it's in the format of a letter that I'm writing to my readers, just telling them more about myself, my travels, my hobbies, my writing life, etc. Again, the response has been great.
So, Elinor, congratulations on promoting your book and the fact that you've got 3 books out. What are you working on as far as future projects?
If I were to write anything, and perhaps the viewers could let me know whether they'd be interested, it would be a sequel to Wildwood, because I have had a number of emails from people saying, well, don't stop there, we want to know what happens next to the characters. I won't tell you whether she is successful in surviving the 365 days. You'll have to read the book to find out, but people want to know more about them.
So the book again is Wildwood. Thank you for being our guest, Elinor. It's great to have you on the show.
Thank you so much.
So I would also like to thank Huckleberry Books, formerly Lotus Books, for having us here today. My name is Keith Powell, and I'm the host of Talking Kootenay Books. Welcome to Talking Kootenay Books. My name is Keith Powell. I'm the host, and today I'm with D.M. Ditson. I understand you're from Invermere. Can you just tell us how you ended up in Invermere and how long you've been there?
Okay, so I've been in Invermere for about 1.5 years. I'm from Saskatchewan originally.
Right.
I was working in government communications in downtown Regina and working in an office building.
So what are you doing in Invermere?
Well, so in my office building, I just kept thinking, I wish I was in the mountains. I wish I was in the mountains. And so I left the job and just came out to see, did I like it in the mountains? And it turns out I very much do.
So you've been here about 1.5 years, I believe you told me. And you're working at the local newspaper, is that correct? How's that been?
Oh, it's amazing. It's amazing. My background is actually in journalism, but I've been in communications for most of my career, and it's really nice to get back into journalism and get to meet people that way.
Okay. So I understand you have a new book coming out. This is your first book.
Yeah.
And I think the scheduled date is coming up here pretty quickly. Can you just tell us about the book and sort of what caused you to write the book as well?
Yes. So my book is my personal story about sexual assault, post-traumatic stress disorder, and recovery. And I wrote it while I was in my recovery. So I was assaulted by a series of men when I was between the ages of 18 and 25. And my book talks a lot about what it was that made me so vulnerable to assault in the first place, and then how my recovery went. Because I did something that I think a lot of survivors do, which is feel ashamed about what's happened and then keep everything as a secret. And so I kept these secrets very tight inside. When I did mention it to people who were very close to me, usually all I would say is bad things happened without going into any detail. And it is very hard for something traumatic to heal if it's just a secret and just suppressed. And so things escalated in my life to the point where I really needed to get better, where I was kind of at the bottom. And that's where I started writing and started letting the secrets out and started letting them breathe, and that's what's turned into this book.
So why did you choose the personal memoir sort of format to tell this account?
So it was the only way that I knew how to tell it. There were other stories that I had seen of people with post-traumatic stress disorder who were going through their recovery, and those were case studies, and they were very clinical. And then other ones that I have seen were, again, like sometimes memoir format, but again, quite clinical. And so I wanted this to be talking about what was physically happening to me, because there was a lot of strange symptoms happening in my body, like a lot of convulsions, a lot of twitching. And so I wanted to show from the inside, from my own experience, what was actually happening to me during the process of my recovery.
Right. So a personal memoir makes it very obviously personal. How did you go about sort of addressing that, getting that down on paper? Was that therapeutic at some point in time?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. So when I first started writing the book, I was writing it for myself. I was writing it as a way for me to heal. And in the very beginning, I just wrote a couple pages and shared it with a friend. And I had expected that my secrets were too dark, that anyone who would read that would think that I was unlovable or would turn away. And so when I shared this with her, it was probably the scariest thing that I've ever done. But she read it and she responded kindly. And so from there, I was able to share it a little bit more and a little bit more. And then I was able to go more into what had actually happened to me and write in more detail. And it was very helpful for me. It was also very hard to do. I'd been working at the City of Regina at the time. I ended up switching to half-time after I'd used up all my vacation, and then I ended up leaving my job. And that was partly to keep writing, but it was mostly because I needed to do so much therapy and so much healing, and it just wasn't sustainable to keep working.
So how long did it take you to put this account down?
So it's right now, as we're talking, it's 5 years since I started. But it took about 2 or 3 years to do the actual writing. And then the last 2 years have been try and find a publisher, get a publisher, and then work through that process.
So let's just talk about the publishing process. So you found a publisher, I
Yes.
have to assume?
Yeah, I'm being published through Kootenay Books in Regina.
And how did that
Saskatchewan
connection
publisher.
happen?
It was really lucky, actually. So at the same time that I had submitted my manuscript to publishers asking if they were interested, I had also submitted to a writing contest. And my book ended up winning that contest in Saskatchewan. It was the John V. Hicks Prize for a long manuscript that had not yet been published. And someone on the board of directors with Kootenay heard that my book was being published, who I knew, and he reached out to me and he said, "Please send us your manuscript. I bet you we're going to be interested." And it turns out that they were, which was great.
So who's the intended audience of your book?
I really want survivors to read it and their loved ones, because it's so difficult to heal, and for me, it felt very lonely. And this is the book that I would have loved to have had available to me during my recovery. And so it's specifically, hopefully, for survivors, but also for their loved ones to know, here's what the process is like, here's kind of how it went for one person. And then really for anyone who's interested in a story of how someone faced difficult things and recovered.
Right. So it's, of course, as we mentioned, a personal memoir. I just wanted to ask you what's in the future. Any other projects? Any other books on the go, or what is your plan?
So my plan is really to focus on this one. So this one to me is a lot bigger than a book.
Okay.
I have a few speaking events coming up. I've actually given a few talks in Regina before I moved out here about post-traumatic stress disorder and recovery. And so I want to continue giving those types of talks, thinking maybe a campus tour of universities at the start of the semester when women are particularly vulnerable to assault. I just really want to keep these conversations going and help people know how to get better and hopefully help these things not happen in the first place.
So again, the name of the book?
It's Wide Open.
And just tell me the significance of that title.
Okay, so it has actually a lot of meanings. I meant it with one in particular, but it's taken on more. But it's a bit about how vulnerable I was to assault and the reasons for that. I think it's important to look at how do we protect people? How do we give them the information that they need? So I was raised very evangelical Christian. It was a very fundamentalist, very sheltered upbringing, and what happened as a result of that is that when my faith fell apart as a young woman, I didn't know what alternatives there existed in the world for me. I didn't know how. For instance, I was on a bus shortly after I stopped believing everything. I was 18, and a pimp sat down beside me, and he offered me a free place to live, and he was going to get me a job. And my immediate response was, "Wow, what a nice guy," right? Like it is not helpful for people to be so sheltered that they don't know how to take care of themselves. And
well, it's like you said, a very personal story, and your accounts really sort of bring it to the forefront. And is that really your objective? Is that your goal? Is to really bring this issue forward and let people sort of think about it and understand the impact?
Yeah, so I want people to know, like, here's the impact of sexual assault, here's kind of the ramifications it had in my own life. But what I really want people to get out of the story is the recovery piece, because that's a big focus in this particular book. And I noticed I found myself just hungry for all of these stories that other people had written about bad things that happened to them and then how they got better. And a lot of the times what I was finding is a story talked about the bad thing that happened to them, and then you would get to the epilogue and they're doing really great now, which fantastic. But what I was really looking for was how did you go from miserable to happy again? How did you get there? What were the steps? And so that was really important to me to show that.
Well,
But
thank
if
you.
can we jump back
Yeah.
for a second?
Yeah, for
so
sure.
you had asked about the meanings of the title. And so Wide Open is also about, I had kept all of my secrets buried inside, and so this is about like expanding and opening that up and letting them out. And then it's also about building this heart that was big enough to accept me how I was.
Right. So many meanings
Yes.
on many levels.
Yes.
Well, congratulations on the upcoming new book, Wide
Thank you.
Open. I appreciate you taking the time and letting us know about it and being a guest on Talking Kootenay Books.
Thank you very much.
So my name is Keith Powell, and this has been Talking Kootenay Books.